Hello, I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. Welcome to the Urban Agenda. On today's edition of the Urban Agenda, we're talking about voting and presidential politics. Joining me are Mark Riley, a longtime New York radio journalist who co-hosts Morning Sedition on the New Air America radio network. Elena Beverly from the NAACP's Legal Defense and Education Fund, and my CSS colleague Gabriel Torres-Rivera, the director of the Community Service Society's nonpartisan voter registration campaign. Welcome to the Urban Agenda.
Thank you.
Well, we have an election coming up, and I'll start with you, Mark. You're reporting on this almost every day at some ungodly hour in the morning.
6 a.m. till 9.
What is your take on this election? How is it affecting, first of all, the national audience you're talking to, but also New York?
There has been an unprecedented outpouring across the country of people registering to vote, in particular young people who are registering to vote. We've seen situations, we're in cities like Madison, Wisconsin, a college town, Columbus, Ohio, a college town, huge lines of people registering to vote, and they're young, and many of them are Black, Latino, Asian. There is an unprecedented interest in participating in this election. Now, I think the conventional wisdom is that these participants are largely going to break Democratic. We'll see. But the bottom line is most observers are seeing unprecedented levels of interest and enthusiasm in voting. And I think a lot of people felt that when the primaries were first decided on the Democratic side, they saw this, but then it kind of waned during the course of the summer. People kind of, went about their business, did whatever, the convention was here. And now it's reignited. And just on those bumper days when the voter registration rolls were closing across the country, there were lines of extraordinary number. And my guess is that an overwhelming majority of those people will in fact turn out to vote on November 2nd without a great deal of prodding.
Gabe, we're doing obviously local registration in New York City. We're not a battleground state. I think this is, I think most of the pundits say this is a foregone conclusion how New York goes. But is there any excitement among the people you're registering?
Well, two things I was thinking about as Mark was speaking. There was an excellent article last week in the New York Times, it was on the 4th, where they wrote about how this election has increased the number of new registrants, not just here, but around the country, so much so that they're providing overtime and hiring new employees. They said not since 1992 has there been this type of a turnout. Also, I was recently asked by a reporter, what is it do I sense in the street, when I do voter registration? And what I sense is a sense of urgency. That's really what I sense. And people coming to me and saying, look, I've never voted before, but I'm going to register and vote in this election. And I think we were talking earlier how about the media is not really letting this out. It sort of seems like there's no energy in this particular election here in New York, but there is, and you feel it when you're on the street.
Now, Elena, the other thing is it right that we're still under supervision in New York under the Voting Rights Act, or are there going to be monitors working in this election? I mean, what?
Yes, well, it is right that we're still under supervision in the Voting Rights Act. There are a number of counties in New York that are under supervision because of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and that has been an integral part in our enforcement powers of minority voting rights, both in New York and elsewhere in the country. We are going to have observers in New York, but also elsewhere around the country, looking to protect the minority vote as well as language minority voting, which is critical here in New York. And I also want to echo what Mr. Torres said just a moment ago, that people are coming out in record numbers. Yeah. The days before the close of registration was so important because everyone recognizes that there are barriers to voting being presented to us here in 2004, and that we're going to get out and vote with a vengeance.
That's an important thing, right. the barriers, because, for example, in Florida, where they're registering people to vote, certainly. But what they're saying is that if you're not if you didn't check the box that said you were a United States citizen, you were precluded from voting even though you had to sign an oath in the same document saying you were a United States citizen.
So a technical deficiency knocks you out of the right to vote.
Exactly. And that can happen in a lot of different cases in a lot of different ways, and people are going to have to be very vigilant. For example, if you move, and the question of which precinct you vote in and whether or not your vote will be valid if they don't have your name in the registration book. These are very
This is such a
difficult.
throwback. This is
Yeah.
what was, you know, my parents' generation were fighting about in the 1950s, where you had to take a literacy test, particularly if you were black in the city of New York, in order to vote.
Something also that's troubling is that I also met with the election protection people and we were trying to decide what polls should be monitored because we know a few people monitoring. So I went to the Board of Elections and I got the polling site for 4 boroughs. And something that struck me is that on the top it says subject to change.
Yes.
So that means it doesn't say when it would change. Would it change the same day of the election? Where do people call? And I see that as very troublesome. And during Amanda Hotline 1 year, and that was the biggest question people calling. Where's my polling site?
Right.
They can't find out.
And the NAACP Legal Defense Fund is one organization in a national coalition of organizations to work on this, to protect the vote. And one thing that voters can do on Election Day, actually prior to Election Day, they can call now 866-OUR-VOTE.
We'll put it on the screen.
866-OUR-VOTE to see where their polling site is, to locate their polling site in preparation for the election. But more so, they can also call on Election Day. If they arrive at their precinct and find that it is closed, they can call that hotline. They can be redirected to their nearest precinct. They can also file a complaint that will be recorded in real time so that we can remedy those problems right then and there.
Okay, we'll put that on the screen. Mark, what kind of issues? I mean, this is not happening because suddenly people wake up one morning and they think this is a vital election. What are you hearing in terms of the national audience? What's driving people for registration? What seems to be the issues that's getting these people interested?
To be blunt, fear of a second Bush term. It's that simple. There are people all over this country that I believe think the country's going in the wrong direction. That the war in Iraq, what has up until now been an extraordinarily stagnant economy over a very long period of time. Your organization did a really great study. 50% of black men ages 16 to 64 in New York City unemployed in the year 2004. That is an extraordinary statistic. And people are reacting to this. People are reacting to how they have to struggle in their own lives. There was a foundation study, I think it was the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations and the Annie Casey Foundation, I believe it is, just did a study of working poor people. 20 million children whose parents can barely make ends meet from week to week. And people are starting to respond to this, not in what has in some cases been typical by saying, well, gee, nothing that the process does really can help me, therefore I'm not going to participate in it. Now people are starting to say, you know what, it's because of the process that I am struggling and I'm going to change the process. That's the difference.
Gabe, what about the young people you're registering?
I was, that's something that was asked because, as I do nonpartisan voter registration, but I have some clear-cut views on these government national international policies. And so the person said to me, so it would seem to me like you would do partisan voter registration. I mean, how do you do nonpartisan? I said, well, it's not difficult at all because the people I register have some very clear-cut views on what they want, what it is that
and what
the
are they
issues.
talking about?
Well, they're talking about jobs. They're talking about the present administration, feeling that it needs to change. They're talking about the school issue. As you know, the latest issue in the schools has been this one test, pass or fail.
Right.
People have issues
They're
with
interested
that.
in
Stakes testing.
So, they have a stake, So to be nonpartisan is simple for me because people out there, unlike in other elections where maybe someone, it was Jesse Jackson running, Mayor Dinkins, and people, we're going to vote a certain way. There are people more talking about the issue.
As you get ready for your work, what seems to be the deepest fear in terms of people being blocked, not only in New York but elsewhere?
Well, in response to that question, I have to touch upon something
Sure,
that they
go right
said.
ahead.
There's a quote by W.E.B. Du Bois that he wrote this in The Souls of Black Folk, that he said, "The power of the ballot we need in sheer self-defense, else what shall prevent us from a second slavery?" And I was recently speaking to a young student. He's actually an LDS scholar who is in his first year of law school, and he said, "I am voting because it's critical. It's important in the effect that it's going to have on my life." And there's, the FEC once wrote up that the community's turnout based on what they appear or what they believe is their stake in society. Well, given the state of the Black community, we have a huge stake in society. Given our health care, you mentioned the job rate, the employment rate, our education, given individuals who want to go on to college who are no longer able to afford that, our infant mortality rate is double that of Caucasian Americans. It's absurd. It's absurd, and our community knows it.
Right. It's like stand out at a pharmacy. You know, go to Dwayne Reed and stand in a pharmacy, and you'll see 80-year-olds, 79-year-olds paying $98, $100 for medication. And that's ridiculous.
And it's either that or food.
You know?
That's right.
So there's a health issue. It's ridiculous.
Now, we did a survey recently where we found that about 20 to 30% of the poor who said that they had only about $100 in reserves. That's their total reserves. And if anything goes wrong, you're finished.
There's another side to this, too, and it's one that's not looked at very often. A second Bush term is going to mean a wholesale change, not just in the Supreme Court, but in district courts all over America. George W. Bush, for example, I know, wants to go after the Ninth Circuit in San Francisco.
Yeah, one of the more
I mean, the conservatives hate that circuit because it's so, quote, liberal, unquote. Watch, if this man is reelected, there will be a wholesale, incremental change in the composition of a lot of these courts.
But Mr. Riley, oh, I'm sorry. Let me mention, though, just as Gabe mentioned, we are a nonpartisan organization. We just want people to get out there and speak for themselves.
Yes. We got
I don't have to be nonpartisan.
Okay, we'll be right back to continue the urban agenda.
That I have to do. I don't have to actually find this? Like a foot away from the trash can.
Yeah, hang on a second. You won't believe this. Please tell me somebody didn't just drop that there.
My husband would freak if he saw this.
Yeah, well, it's been there a while.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Man, I'm like this close to throwing it away myself.
I don't blame you. I mean, who would...
Don't just take a stand. Act. The most powerful way is to simply register and vote.
We're discussing presidential politics in this, our last edition of the Urban Agenda before the election. Joining me are Mark Riley of the Air America Radio Network, Elena Beverly from the NAACP's Legal Defense and Education Fund, and my CSS colleague, Gabriel Torres-Rivera. We've been talking about new voters. The poll numbers keep coming out. Every day I hear a new poll. Are these new voters being reflected in those polls? I'll start with you, Mark, because you're seeing the national, and Elena.
Generally not. New voters very rarely make polls of likely voters because one of the criteria they use for determining someone to be a likely voter is how often they voted before. So it's a catch-22. You really kind of have to establish a track record as a voter before most polling organizations will consider you a likely voter. That's why you always see 1 or 2 point gaps in most instances between registered and likely voters in most polls.
And Gabe, you know, what do you think? Are these new voters who are coming online, are they going to vote?
Yes, they're going to vote. I mean, that's what I'm picking up in the street. You know, people are registering because I've had people who never registered to vote and say, I'm going to register because I need to vote in this election. And, you know, alluding to the polls, first of all, I don't believe in them, but I don't think that they poll young people. I don't think, the young people now rely on cell phones. They don't sit at home and wait to be called, I've never been called, to find out what my opinion is. So I'm always wondering, well, who are these people that they're polling, but young people are not being polled, and they are going to go.
That's my understanding. They don't even do cell phone polls.
No,
my son, who's
they
24, doesn't have a landline.
Yeah, this is the first election in a long time where I've actually seen young kids walking around the streets with a T-shirt or something alluding to voting. Huh. I mean, I hadn't seen that in past elections, not even in '92.
It's become hugely popular to be part of your political system, to actually engage and have a political voice. And part of it is the popularity of it. For example, Puff Daddy, Sean Puffy Combs has the T-shirt that says "Vote or Die," and it's
all over the place.
The MTV Music Awards had voting everywhere, and I still consider myself part of that generation to a certain extent.
In the past, you've had Hollywood people who would pick a certain candidate that they wanted to support, but this is the first time I'm also seeing younger actors and who are saying get out the vote. You have Drew Barrymore, Winona Ryder, just the actors who are actually doing PSAs on it.
Let's talk a little longer term. Do you think this is there's going to be a transformation? Are we seeing something, a significant long-term shift here in terms of how a younger generation takes to voting?
You mean in terms of participation?
Yeah. Is this the beginning of something?
Let's hope so. Yeah. I mean, but see, young people have to understand how the process works.
Right.
And polling is not really, it no longer is just about showing numbers. It drives fundraising and it drives media coverage. And it especially drives media coverage. Next year, when we have a mayoral race here in New York, watch how the different candidates end up being shoved out of the race to some extent because their poll numbers are low, they can't raise any money, and the media won't cover them. It's happened before, it's going to happen again.
See, one thing that I try to tell young people when I do voting workshops, because they'll say, well, look, it doesn't matter, you vote for one candidate, then they do what they want once they're in office. But I try to explain to them, we have to see voting as a protracted struggle.
Absolutely.
One of the things that we tend to do, especially in this country, is that we become involved in a political process during an election. Then when the election is over, then they're no longer following up on this candidate that they voted for. And I'm telling them, look, it doesn't matter who the candidate is, whether it be black, white, gay, straight. I says, we have to see what issues are they pushing for that affect our communities. And then you have to say throughout that person's term, listen, are you doing what you said you're going to do? As groups, as organizations. And then when they come up for re-election, you either reward them or punish them with the vote.
You called me a youngin' earlier, so let me go ahead and respond.
We won't take that.
I'll respond as the youngin' at the table. One thing that I think my generation really can't stand is being told what to do or being denied a right. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that in preparation for the 2004 election. For example, in Texas, Prairie View, Texas, Prairie View A&M is an historically black college in Texas, and there was a local district attorney down there who wanted to threaten students with prosecution if they chose to register and vote at their school.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
Brought black students out, young folks out in huge numbers, and we're seeing these barriers. I mean, obviously, the district attorney had to recant his statement and ultimately was forced to resign because of the pressures of national civil rights organizations. But those students came out, and we're seeing this all over the country where there are students who are mobilizing and saying, I want to have a right to register and vote in the community where I live right now, which happens to be my school or wherever. And they're also saying that we recognize that former offenders are being removed from the rolls, and that's a huge part of the black community, and we're not going to let the politicians believe that they can just take a chunk of our community and throw it away. We are going to turn out in record numbers to compensate for those losses that we have in the prisons.
And there's a byproduct of this that hopefully will take place beyond this election. When you're talking about young people, you're talking about the possibility of fundamental change in elections other than for president. And for example, in the legislative primary, 98% of the incumbents won. If an influx of young people to the process means that the next election maybe only 60% of them win, you will have affected a fundamental change in the way what is obviously a dysfunctional New York State legislature works.
And it's interesting, it has two impacts. Even if they're not defeated, they can't take extreme positions if they expect it to be. This is what happened to the DA.
Accountable.
Clearly, who was very pro-Rockefeller drug laws, a Democrat who got into a primary and, to the shock of the entire Democratic, in this case, Democratic establishment, got beaten very badly. And that was a combination of progressive Democratic voters and obviously the work of third parties and the rest.
That happened here in New York State also with the DA was pushing the Rockefeller drug laws you're talking about.
That's who I'm talking about, by a guy who was a virtual unknown, who came in and got people upset. Why is he doing this when most of our kids, what community that I knew about doesn't have a relative or some cousin or uncle who didn't at one point get into trouble? And after they've served their time, of course you have to have them back into the workforce and helped.
That's right.
Well,
I'm sorry.
I mean, I want to address that after they've served their time. It's not, when it comes to voting, though.
That's true.
There's no peniological reason for having, to remove the right to vote for individuals who are behind bars. And in fact, if you ask me, that is where the civil rights movement, I mean, I know we're in agreement on this. That's where the civil rights movement ended.
Right.
There are huge numbers of our community who are packed behind bars without the vote.
Well, what's even more, I think what turned our issues with my board on this issue was the fact that those incarcerated individuals are being used for representation in upstate communities.
That's right.
That's insane. That hasn't happened until since slavery, where essentially a slave was counted in order to provide congressional and other representation. That's not fair.
Right.
If you're going to use them for, getting a state assemblyman in the middle of the Western Tier or wherever, they have to be allowed to participate.
Right.
And there's a movement really around the whole disenfranchisement issue around the country. That's an issue we've also been working on. The October issue of Essence Magazine had, in fact, Janae Nelson from the NAACP-LDF was interviewed in it. And I had fun. I have a list. People have been calling me from Texas, Colorado. I've gotten calls from Missouri, Alabama, with people wanting to discuss this whole issue of disenfranchisement, which is, impacts for the most part Black and Latinos.
That's right.
And see, a success here feeds on itself. If young people see that they can affect the process, if they can elect people, if they can take people out of office, it encourages more people to participate because it destroys this myth that my vote really doesn't count because nothing ever changes.
But I think even win or lose here, I think there has to be a transformation here. I mean, fights for the prior generation were not even nearly this easy in many respects. And there has to
But
be
see, young people don't always like to hear you say that.
But I think
I'm telling you,
there's a lot of
you have to come to it your own way, though.
Yeah.
That's
I
right.
mean, this is not for us.
Yeah.
People have to come to an understanding in their own time. I mean, any more than my father's generation when they came back from the war and they couldn't even join the Democratic Party.
But I think we're starting to get it. I think we're starting to get it because we recognize that the barriers that we're encountering today, the identification checks at the polls, the provisional ballots that aren't going to be counted, the fact that tens of thousands of individuals are purged from a registration roll, we're seeing that as related to this long and graphic history of denial of the right to vote for the African American community. I mean, we still see ourselves as part of the community, and we know that our community as a whole has had to overcome more barriers than any other community to participate in our society. This is just one more step.
We know an easy, when we're talking about felon voting, we think of the 250,000 black men who are unemployed.
Right.
Large
11%
numbers of
of the
them
black
are
community, right.
they're basically there, many of them are there because of former felony records.
Exactly.
The issue becomes that once they have that incarceration record, they can't work again.
Yeah, that's
The only way to start changing that is mobilization. Because I don't care how corrupt or antagonistic a politician is, if you can get a group of tens of thousands of people registered on one issue and focused, certainly the religious right has shown us that, focused on the issue, the barriers, you can't be a plumber, you can't be a barber, all those barriers fall because they've only been allowed to do that because there's no perceived political force.
And one of the great contradictions about that is that when you go up for parole, what heightens your chances of getting parole is if you bring a letter of assurance from a prospective employer.
Right.
Then when you get out, you're limited in where you can be employed. I mean, they don't even have, like I tell people, I said, there's a statute of limitation on practically everything but murder in this country.
Mark, I'm going to let you close for us. We got to go.
Okay. This is a very, very important election. No matter where you stand on the issues, vote your issues, vote your concerns. It is crucially important that everyone understands. Red state, blue state, swing state, it doesn't matter. You have to get out and exercise your franchise, and you'll be happy you did.
My thanks to Mark Riley of the Air America Radio Network, Elena Beverly from the NAACP's Legal Defense and Education Fund, and my CSS colleague, Gabriel Torres-Rivera. I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society, and thank you for watching the Urban Agenda. To learn more about the work of the Community Service Society of New York or to comment on the Urban Agenda, please contact us at 212-614-5425 and on the web at www.cssny.org.